All right, our topic for today is the growth of the church and the persecution of the church. And I think I can go either way on that. But let me just start with this. How do you think the early church grew? How do you think it grew to the time that in the early 300s, Constantine decides to make it the state religion? What happened between Jesus' crucifixion, resurrection, in which they're huddled in these closed rooms, and all of a sudden it becomes dominant? Totally, the Romans killed Jesus, and yet within 300 years, Christians are beginning to take over. Gene?
I think I remember you telling once about, maybe that would have come much later. I was thinking of the plague, but that was much later, wasn't it? Yeah, okay. Sorry. In the first 300, I don't know.
Pentecost, 20 people.
Okay, Pentecost.
Holy Spirit, 1,000 people. Pentecost inspired church growth.
Okay.
Well, even just the persecution led itself, because the persecution in Jerusalem, a lot of people dispersed. They avoided it. They said the apostles stayed, but there was a spread just for that. But even that persecution made people disperse and went to different areas. But obviously, and it seems like in the biblical accounts in Acts, it's just the whole way of the Lord's working, like the visions to Peter, that suddenly it's okay to interact with Gentiles. They changed their thinking in that line, so that it was okay to go to this whole other population that if they hadn't gone to it, would have continued to be just a Jewish sect that would have missed the whole point of Abraham about the blessing to be a blessing.
Yeah, sure.
And now I agree with Stephen about the Holy Spirit and Dee about the dispersal, the persecution coming down. But also, I had read somewhere quite some time ago that within the human, within us, is this drive to know God. And so I think that too is part of it, because the people were living, yes, in their gods, the pagan gods, were immoral, blah, 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 and there's this hunger in the human spirit to know God. So probably, the Holy Spirit, not only giving power to those who gave the message, but softening the hearts of people to open up to the true God. So this in both ways acting.
And then in terms of the church today, given how, the understanding of how the early church grew, then what is it that we think we should do as the church today to do? Look what success they had. What can we pick up from them that we should be about? I guess that would be a question I would ask. What do you think? What did they do that we could do as well?
Spread the word.
Spread the word. Is that a good example? Yeah, you've kind of given me what I thought you'd give me. Because when we read the book of Acts, and our Bible only goes to the end of about the first century, so we don't have much of what happens after that when we really see a significant growth in the church. But the church really didn't grow rapidly. It grew steadily, they say, at a rate of about 3.5% a year. Well, if you do 3.5% over a couple, 300 years, you've got a pretty good rate of growth. But I think in minds of many Christians, we kind of have that Pentecost where 3,000 were baptized on that day, and that this thing just kind of took off like a fire and just kind of exploded. And that's really not the way the church happened. There certainly may have been pockets of that, but that's not really the way it was. Pentecost was the beginning of it. And one of the things I'd like to point out about the Pentecost experience and the speaking in different languages. And if you want to get into the differences between their speaking in tongues and Pentecost and what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, I'll be glad to go there if you want. But it's not the same. These were specific languages in which people from the Jews that had been scattered returned to Jerusalem for this Feast of Pentecost. Pentecost was a Jewish festival before it became a Christian festival. All right? It was a harvest festival. And so people would come to offer their first fruits of the harvest, and it was a great festival in which people would make pilgrimages to Jerusalem and to the temple. The significance of speaking in different languages goes back to Genesis 11. Remember the Tower of Babel in which everybody was scattered. All the languages, all the peoples were scattered. Through Pentecost now, through the Holy Spirit coming upon them, it is now the church, the mission of the church is now to bring all these languages back together. It is God restoring what was broken and separated and returning it all back to Him. So the mission is the same as it was in the very beginning in Genesis 12, in which Abraham and his descendants were to be a blessing to all the nations. Now we see in Pentecost who's being blessed in this experience? All the nations. Right? So we just often don't see the Bible as a whole. We pick it apart and pick certain things out, but there is a continuation in terms of mission and theme that God has been doing throughout all of history. Any questions on that? You probably already knew that, or now that I reminded you of what you already knew, if you got it. Okay. And then the church began to grow, and it grew initially in Acts by the apostles, and then the apostles get too much work for them to do, so they call and say, we got to appoint some others. And two of the most famous of those who were appointed were Stephen and Philip. And of course, Stephen becomes the first martyr. He does his work. He was put there. Remember, if you read that, what was Stephen and Philip? What were they called to do? Remember? Maybe that wasn't our reading. Maybe I just read it between.
Deacon?
They were called to take care of the widows.
Take care of the widow.
Take care of the widows. There was too much. There were too many people to care for, and the apostles didn't have time to care for them, plus do the preaching and stuff that they needed to do. So they had to give up the caregiving to someone else. So they were not expected to do everything. And so as they had to focus on what they were focusing on, the early community said that we have to appoint others and elect others to do some of these jobs that need to be done. Otherwise, we're going to be spending all of our time caring for these things and not proclaiming and getting the message out there.
Isn't that true today?
It can be. Yeah, I think it's true today, although most people in congregations don't. They kind of expect, for example, the pastor to do it all. So that's an expectation in many churches. That's why the average size church, worshiping community in the United States, across denominations, is 90 people a Sunday. In our denomination, it's much more than that. It's 114. And the reason for that is that's all the people a pastor can take care of. That's about it. And so the size of a congregation gets to be the size of the ability in which the people can relate to the pastor and the pastor can care for the people. And when it gets to be too many more than that, it just can't happen. So congregations stay small so that the pastor can tend to them. And that's the role of chaplain that we like our pastors to be. But in the early church, they kind of said, no, we have to keep moving out. And we need to keep getting this out. And so they put people specifically to tend to some certain caregiving needs. Philip, though, couldn't just stick to that. He also had to preach, and the sermon got him killed. So when, pardon me? Yeah. So Stephen, yeah. So when you do proclaim what God gives you and tell the story, don't expect people to run up to you and say, baptize me. They might, that's the eunuch or the Ethiopian, but not so, it's not often the case, I guess. So he gets persecuted for that. But he's got a great sermon. And if you read that sermon, you'll notice how it's an Old Testament sermon. Isn't it?
Yep.
It's a wonderful, short little narrative of all that God has been doing. That's why what we call the Bible and the history in the Bible, Hans isn't here today, it's called Heilgeschichte. Any of you know what that is?
Holy something.
Holy what?
Holy.
Holy something. Holy Geschichte. I shouldn't tell you this, but since I know you'll never talk outside of this room, it's in total confidence. In seminary, we